Professor Orwin is going to speak first, and then, by their permission, I will make a brief response to Professor Orwin, and then Professor Bauman will speak. I'm not going to speak last because I fear that after Bauman talks, what I have to say would seem anticlimactic. So after all of us give our remarks, we invite questions from the audience. If when you have a question, you would kindly step to the microphone off to your right and my left, so that everybody can hear the question. And Wiley Runestrand, who is recording this whole event, will be able to capture the questioner as well as the answer.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Glowacki for his kind introduction. It's an honor as well as a pleasure to speak here. For one thing, both Professor Bauman and Professor Kortansky are among my oldest academic and other friends. We go back to our undergraduate days at Cornell University many decades ago. I also always enjoy coming to Hiram to speak, because Hiram is, as a liberal arts college should be, a beacon of the serious consideration of serious questions. I'm also grateful to Professor Kortansky for the invitation to attend your earlier discussion of civility on February 7th, the one featuring the 3 distinguished panelists in conversation with the Garfield scholars. I remained silent on that occasion as one on which it was better just to listen and learn. I will speak this evening, however, having been specifically invited to do so. Civility is a topic to which I've given some thought in the past. I published an essay on it in 1991, in which I proposed that civility in our political life was a matter of substance as well as tone, and I linked it to the political teaching underlying the American founding. Just this year, I've updated that essay for a volume on the subject of endangered virtues, of which, as emerged in the session 3 weeks ago, we can certainly regard civility as one. But enough about me. It so happens that on both these points, that civility is tangential to American politics today, and that it would be central to that politics as properly conceived, I found a celebrated ally. It will be his thought, and not my own, that I'll be expounding for the rest of this session. As the title of my talk has disclosed, I refer to America's first executive, and therefore ex officio her first citizen, who is also her first worrier when it comes to this question of civility. Before turning to Mr. Obama's thought, however, I want to enter 2 demurs. The first is that I'm not an Americanist, or even an expert in American political thought. It's my study of political thought as such that has drawn me to that of Barack Obama. My second demur is that I'm neither an Obama-phile nor an Obama-phobe. Lovers and haters of the president will find this talk equally disappointing. As will soon be clear, however, I do find Mr. Obama's thought worthy of consideration. No president for a very long time now has sought, as he has, to articulate a new vision of what it means to be an American, as well as to express that vision through his own demeanor. To many Americans inured to the sleazy conduct of certain recent past presidents, have abandoned the notion of the president as exemplary. Mr. Obama, to his credit, has not, nor, it's only fair to note, had George W. Bush. Mr. Obama's concern with morality has transcended politics and the political classes to extend to the everyday conduct of the members of a free society. His personal life has been above reproach, and he has offered us advice in leading ours. Obviously, Mr. Obama has sought to set the example of a good husband and father, and there's nothing more that I need to say about that. So far as our relations with our fellow citizens generally are concerned, he would have us practice 2 virtues above all others: civility and empathy. One hears complaints that Mr. Obama has never explained himself or what he stands for. In fact, he has explained, and more than once, that he stands for the principles just mentioned. The 2, civility and empathy, are closely related, so much so that we might understand them as 2 sides of the same coin. I will therefore resort occasionally in the course of this talk to a truly obnoxious locution that I share with all too many other professors and refer to empathy/civility. Now, Mr. Obama has presented empathy/civility as the guiding principle alike of his private life and of his political activity, indeed of his hopes for the future of America. In the form most suitable for widespread consumption, that is, as a refrain, empathy anchored the keynote address to the 2004 Democratic National Convention that first brought Mr. Obama national notice, as it has many of his stump speeches since. It's a tribute to Mr. Obama's most schematic treatment of empathy, and here I'll say empathy/civility, that consideration of it discloses not only the strengths but the problems of this principle as a moral and political norm. So the next section of the talk is called From Compassion to Empathy. First from Bill Clinton and then from George W. Bush, the American public had heard a lot of talk about compassion. Clinton had felt our pain, and Bush had promoted compassionate conservatism. It hadn't changed the world, that talk. But then America entered the age of Obama. No presidential candidate since FDR had faced such grave crises, both domestic and foreign. Sorry, there seems to be a page missing, or I misshuffled it. Here it is. And none had inspired such fervent hopes. If anyone was looking for Mr. Obama to beat the drum for compassion, however, they were soon disappointed. It wasn't so much what Mr. Obama said about compassion as that he said so little about it. His two books, so expansive and eloquent, were unforthcoming on the subject. Dreams from My Father exposed Mr. Obama's conflicted soul, but modestly refrained from presenting compassion as one of its elements. The Audacity of Hope, his later politically programmatic volume, did blame George W. Bush for promoting compassionate conservatism and failing to deliver it. It also listed compassion as one of, quote, a constellation of behaviors that express Americans' mutual regard for one another, unquote. Compassion wasn't, however, the value that Obama stressed in the book. That honor fell to empathy. At first, the differences between compassion and empathy might seem slight. Even Mr. Obama conceded that empathy was readily misinterpreted as, quote, a call to sympathy or charity, unquote. Yet he thus underscored that this was a misinterpretation. A call to sympathy or charity was not what empathy was. In fact, as I've already suggested, it was closer to a call to civility. There was nothing arbitrary or accidental about Mr. Obama's choice of the discourse of empathy over that of compassion. There were several reasons for it, the first of which was rhetorically strategic. Casting himself as his own man in relation to the Democratic Party establishment, he needed to find his own voice and stake out his own terms. Compassion was not such a term. Its prime had fallen during the Clinton years, and the Clintons had retained custody of it. It now belonged to Hillary Clinton, Mr. Obama's principal Democratic rival. She was the favorite of the party establishment, used to preaching compassion, and of older voters, used to hearing it preached. Empathy, by contrast, was new, like Mr. Obama himself. It furnished his passport to a different place, still a democratic place, but lying somewhere out beyond the party's traditional concerns. It also proved crucial to his discourse of so-called post-partisanship. Post-partisanship as a term was apparently the coinage of California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He applied it to his own policy of mixing and matching approaches to the governance of California drawn from the repertories of both major parties. His circumstances, however, as a fluke Republican governor in a heavily Democratic state, were quite unlike Mr. Obama's. When, therefore, journalists, including myself, took to applying to the candidate the term coined by the governor, we changed the meaning accordingly. Post-partisanship, as Mr. Obama practiced it, addressed a problem, his awareness of which pervaded the audacity of hope. This was that his most fervent supporters expected him to be as partisan as they were, just as the Democratic Party demanded of its freshman senator unswerving loyalty to its agenda. The broader public, by contrast, had had it with parties, partisanship, and partisan agendas. Mr. Obama addressed this dilemma by pressing hard on the issues, thus gratifying partisans, while cultivating a rhetoric suitable for courting independence. While remaining emphatically a Democrat, he set out to establish himself as more than just a Democrat. This was the project of the audacity of hope and of Mr. Obama's sojourn in the Senate generally. His appropriation of Abraham Lincoln furthered it, and so did his appeal to empathy and civility. What Mr. Obama meant by empathy softened partisanship without negating it. Yes, we can understand it as the mark of a New Age politician, but the New Age in question was an era of ill feeling. Relations between the parties had been deeply embittered by the Monica Lewinsky affair and the subsequent impeachment, by the so-called stolen election of 2000, and by the divisiveness of the Iraq War and the war against terror. Mr. Obama's politics may have been new, but they still had to be contemporary. While he might contend with Hillary Clinton for the title of angry Democrat best suited to reach out to Republicans, he wasn't about to waffle on any of his core issues. From the outset of his career on the national stage, Mr. Obama had drawn on deep wells of partisan anger. Later, this would prove an unstated given of his presidential campaign. On election night 2008, having been tapped as a commentator by Canada's national broadcaster, the CBC, I happened to call attention to it. This infuriated an Obama supporter we were piping in from Philadelphia. How dare I suggest that Mr. Obama had appealed to any but the loftiest sentiments? In truth, the candidate hadn't stooped to whipping up rancor. He hadn't had to. These angry voters were already in his pocket. They needed no reminders why they preferred him to both John McCain and Mrs. Clinton. It was the Iraq War, stupid. This wrath was already in full bloom during Mr. Obama's sojourn in the Senate and his writing of audacity. Neither Democrats nor Republicans were inclined to give an inch to the other, and Mr. Obama knew better than to ask that of the colleagues on his side of the aisle. He requested not that they moderate their views, but only that they extend empathy to Republicans and others who rejected those views. Where they could not accept, they would learn to understand. Where they must oppose, they would strive to do so without rancor. Without superseding partisanship, empathy would lend it a gentle or more human face. This was one reason, the immediate political one, why empathy was front and center in the argument of audacity. It distilled the essence of Mr. Obama's post-partisan stance. I don't mean to imply, however, that empathy was just a talking point. There's every reason to credit Mr. Obama's claim that he prized no virtue more highly than he did empathy and civility. On examination, however, empathy proves a complex or composite virtue. On the one hand, it was meant to curb, if not partisanship as such, then the excesses associated with it. Here, it was to second another virtue touted by Mr. Obama, this being precisely civility. On the other hand, however, Mr. Obama presented empathy as implying a partisanship or activism of its own, his distinctive activism and partisanship. Now, Mr. Obama's exposition of empathy, as I've suggested already, repays serious consideration. To it, he devotes several pages of the audacity of hope. Lest any reader be tempted to disregard these pages as the ephemeral or tendentious twaddle of your typical ghost-written political book, Audacity is not a book of that sort. Far from an extended pamphlet composed by others while Mr. Obama was busy with the work of the Senate, it was Mr. Obama's refuge from that tedious work. His biographer, David Remnick, recounts his situation in the Senate as follows. The truth was, David Axelrod told me, Barack hated being a senator. He was so bored being a senator, one Senate aide said, his frustration was obvious to everyone in the office. So Remnick continues, the one project that did engage Obama fully was work on the audacity of hope. He procrastinated for a long time and then, facing his deadline, wrote nearly a chapter a week. Quote, this was not your average senator writing a book, unquote, one aide said. Quote, his whole soul went into it. So it meant that there was less of him to go around elsewhere. In the office, he was distracted. He wasn't thrilled to be living the life of a senator, even on the best of days. So he was punching the clock during the day and then coming alive at night to write the book, the aide went on. The book was about a mortgage and cashing in on the success of the first book, and the book was a way to think through who he was and what he stood for. It was a culmination of thinking and refinement. He created a mechanism where he was chained to the mast and had to figure out who he was to meet a book deadline. Now, this is a recurring theme in all who've known Mr. Obama, his life as a still unfinished voyage of self-discovery, and obviously, in the view of the aide, writing this book was an important chapter in Mr. Obama's quest for self-discovery. I think that that's right, and that the passage on empathy, above all, confirms it. For most of the book, however, Mr. Obama's quest remains on a suitably prosaic plane. The tone is careful, politic, one of studied moderation. This doesn't diminish the value of the book. It represents Mr. Obama's serious effort to meet the burden of expectation that a national politician offer a well-considered perspective on every national issue. Mr. Obama's discussion of empathy occurs at a crucial juncture in the book as the culmination of the chapter entitled Values. The only virtue to receive such schematic treatment, empathy emerges as central to Mr. Obama's vision of himself, of the Democratic Party, and of the promise of American life. While we certainly can understand empathy as son of compassion, like most offspring, its resemblance to its parent is limited. Unwilling to receive compassion as a hand-me-down from the Clintons, Mr. Obama not only renamed it, but rethought it from the bottom up. Empathy figures in The Audacity of Hope as the ultimate spur to the political activism that Mr. Obama takes himself to exemplify. He commends it as such to his fellow Democrats and ultimately to all Americans. His presentation of it is, however, complex and equivocal. It develops the ambiguity already implicit in his post-partisan rhetoric. Empathy is to serve at the same time to inspire partisanship and to moderate it. Mr. Obama begins from a model empathetic. His predecessor is Senator from Illinois, the late Paul Simon, of whom he writes as follows. People sensed that Paul lived out his values, that he was honest, and that he stood up for what he believed in, and perhaps most of all, that he cared about them and what they were going through. This last aspect of Paul's character, a sense of empathy, is one that I find myself appreciating more and more as I get older. It is at the heart of my moral code, and it is how I understand the golden rule, not simply as a call to sympathy or charity, but as something more demanding, a call to stand in somebody else's shoes and see through their eyes. So that's the end of the quotation. At the heart of Mr. Obama's moral code and how he understands the golden rule, there's an emphatic statement for you. And it's not as if his pages are littered with such superlatives. No, he's a careful writer, and this is his only statement in this vein. When it comes to moral bedrock, then, no one can plausibly accuse Mr. Obama of concealing where he stands or even of failing to express himself clearly. The reference to the golden rule is especially revealing, for that is, of course, Christ's formulation of his general maxim applicable to every human situation. Throughout his book, Mr. Obama calls on Democrats to practice this virtue among themselves, and especially for more progressive ones like himself to stand in the shoes of the more conservative ones on issues such as abortion and gun control. He also calls on them to display empathy toward Republicans. He exhorts partisans of every stripe to recognize the patriotism and good faith of their opponents, to recognize that their own side of an issue isn't the only one, that reasonable people will differ on complex and sometimes agonizing issues of public policy. Just as nothing that he found as a freshman senator so disturbed him as the poisonous partisanship prevailing in Washington, so he suggests that no more urgent task beckons Americans than to repudiate it. In the passage that we've been discussing, however, Mr. Obama proceeds from his eulogy of Paul Simon to an earlier beneficial influence in his life, namely that of his mother. And in keeping with his reference to the golden rule, he proceeds from treating empathy as something desirable in political partisans to casting it as the crucial virtue for us all. He writes as follows, "Like most of my values, I learned about empathy from my mother. She disdained any kind of cruelty or thoughtlessness or abuse of power, whether it expressed itself in the form of racial prejudice or bullying in the schoolyard or workers being underpaid. Whenever she saw even a hint of such behavior in me, she would look me square in the eyes and ask, How do you think that would make you feel? Now, this is a fascinating paragraph, not least for its suggestion that only his mother's intervention prevented the youthful Obama from indulging his natural hints of prejudice, bullying, and yes, underpaying workers. Did he haggle over the price that his sister Maya Sotoro asked at her lemonade stand? Unless she steps forward, we may never know. Now, it's striking how quickly Mr. Obama moves from distinguishing empathy from sympathy or charity, which I'll amalgamate as compassion, to equating them. What is the injunction to stand in somebody's shoes and to see the world through their eyes, if not a call to grasp what they suffer standing in the shoes that they do? How then does empathy differ from what liberals have traditionally understood as compassion? First, I think, as more differs from the same. Empathy shines as a deeper, more genuine, more powerful version of sympathy or charity. Through it, we enter into the feelings of the other as fully as humanly possible. If we no longer use the term compassion, that's because we're describing something beyond what commonly passes for compassion. Mr. Obama rightly discerned that this last term had suffered all the ravages of overuse and had become devalued. By substituting a new one, he hoped to recapture its original power. Considered in this light, empathy doesn't define a new moral and political program for liberals so much as exhort them to fulfill an old one. So he continues, I find myself returning again and again to my mother's simple principle, how would that make you feel, as a guidepost for my politics. It's not a question we ask ourselves enough, I think. As a country, we seem to be suffering from an empathy deficit. We wouldn't tolerate schools that don't teach, that are chronically underfunded and understaffed and underinspired, if we thought that the children in them were like our children. It's hard to imagine the CEO of a company giving himself a multi-million-dollar bonus while cutting health care coverage for his workers if he thought they were in some sense his equals. And it's safe to assume that those in power would think longer and harder about launching a war if they envisioned their own sons and daughters in harm's way. Now, Mr. Obama offers this as counsel not just to other politicians like himself, but again to all Americans. We would be better as both human beings and citizens if we undertook this simple intellectual exercise. And an intellectual exercise is what it is. Note the recurrence of the verb think in the paragraph that I've just read. What Mr. Obama means by empathy isn't a spontaneous sentiment, but a mental discipline. Our collective lack is one of, quote, envisioning, unquote, and envisioning requires thinking. Now, this too partly explains why Mr. Obama invokes empathy rather than compassion, that term so long in honor with his party. Compassion is a feeling, and Mr. Obama wants us to move beyond mere feeling. Now, many have noted the contrasting public styles of Mr. Obama and Bill Clinton. Mr. Obama is a cool character. Not for him that instinctive response to others, that intemperate love of pressing the flesh that so defined Mr. Clinton. Mr. Obama is neither touchy nor feely. He is clear and dry-eyed. The only tears to water the 2008 campaign trail were shed by Mrs. Clinton. Mr. Obama appealed to hope, but without gushing sentiment. While the avowed champion of ordinary people, he has never claimed to feel their pain. And while some have cast this as a disappointment of his performance of president, as if there were an earlier, warmer Mr. Obama, in fact, it is fully consistent with his presentation of himself in Audacity. In neither of his books does Mr. Obama claim any special sensitivity to the suffering of others. Quite the opposite. His mother, you'll recall, had tried to drum the notion of empathy into his pubescent brain, but as he admits, without great success. Only in his senior year of high school, in coping with another relative, Stanley Dunham, his maternal grandfather and surrogate father, did he himself draw the conclusion that the grief he was causing another outweighed any justification for it. So he writes as follows about this revelatory moment. I started to think about the struggles and disappointments he had seen in his life. I started to appreciate his need to feel respected in his own home. I realized that abiding by his rules would cost me a little, but to him it would mean a lot. I recognized that sometimes he really did have a point, and that insisting on getting my way all the time without regard to his feelings and needs, I was in some way diminishing myself. So warm and spontaneous this decision wasn't. As Mr. Obama has presented the empathy deficit of the broader society as one of envisioning, so he casts his own moral awakening as an intellectual one. He turned thoughtful in the moral sense of that term only once he had become so in its intellectual sense. His confession should gladden all among us whose decent treatment of others is more a matter of the head than the heart. As empathy had worked a moral revolution in the adolescent Mr. Obama, so Mr. Obama, the author, looked to it for one in the life of the nation. He wrote, "I believe a stronger sense of empathy would tilt the balance of our current politics in favor of those people who are struggling in this society. After all, if they are like us, then their struggles are our own. If we fail to help, we diminish ourselves." Now, while Mr. Obama leaves unstated the policy implications of this tilt, so-called, it emerges from the pages of the book as an ongoing project. Slowly but surely, a tide of empathy would raise all boats. As the fortunate among us helped the struggling, over time their struggles would diminish until they approached the human minimum. Now, so far, Audacity has divided the political landscape between the struggling, the designated beneficiaries of empathy, and the rest of us, its designated providers. Yet this isn't Mr. Obama's final word on the subject. If empathy differs from compassion, first in being more vigorous than it, and secondly in being more cerebral, the third difference is that unlike compassion, empathy is a two-way street. The compassion of the Clinton years had traveled de haut en bas. The politicians and other fat cats had dispensed it, and those in need received it. Mr. Clinton was quick to feel our pain, but only when scandal and impeachment laid him low had he implored us to condescend to his. Empathy, by contrast, is due to all. Mr. Obama writes as follows, "But that does not mean that those who are struggling, or those of us who claim to speak for those who are struggling, are thereby freed from trying to understand the perspectives of those who are better off. Black leaders need to appreciate the legitimate fears that may cause some whites to oppose affirmative action. Union representatives can't afford not to understand the competitive pressures their employers may be under. I am obligated to try to see the world through George Bush's eyes, no matter how much I may disagree with him. That's what empathy does. It calls us all to task, the conservative and the liberal, the powerful and the powerless, the oppressed and the oppressor. We are all shaken out of our complacency. We are all forced beyond our limited vision. No one is exempt from the call to find common ground." This blast against moral complacency offers the harshest reproof of Mr. Obama's fellow partisans to be found in Audacity. Republicans enjoyed no monopoly on smugness, and it was high time for Democrats to shake off theirs. We can now see another, and ultimately the most important reason why Mr. Obama has adopted the term empathy rather than sticking with compassion. Compassion implies many fine things, but reciprocity isn't among them. We don't speak of the compassion of the weak for the strong, of the poor for the rich, or of the sick for the healer. Mr. Obama seems to have concluded that for this very reason, compassion is inadequate to the task of animating a society of free and equal citizens. The rhetoric of compassion is generous to a fault, for it doesn't just console the disadvantaged, but it patronizes and coddles them. It encourages them to think of themselves as takers, free of any obligation to give in their turn. It thereby fosters passivity and a sense of grievance and entitledness. Empathy represents Mr. Obama's attempt to correct this defect, to lift us all above mere compassion by insisting that we conceive it as reciprocal. Whereas compassion condescends to the struggling, empathy dignifies them. By assuming the civic responsibility that empathy implies, they earn the right to pride themselves as the equals of any. So where compassion has created clients, empathy would forge citizens. Here, Mr. Obama shows a certain toughness, which redeems his praise of empathy from insipidness. He is not, you should forgive the expression, a bleeding heart liberal. Civic duty comes first, and we must learn to rise above our private troubles, special interests, and particular grievances if we're to be citizens worthy of the name. This is as true for the poor as for the rich, and only an understanding of empathy that recognizes this necessity will serve to unite rather than to divide us, to bridge the chasms between us rather than deepen them. Now, at the same time, but in a different realm of discourse, Mr. Obama's reinterpretation of empathy as reciprocity evokes the ghost of Immanuel Kant, not to mention John Rawls and other recent quasi-Kantians with whom Mr. Obama would have become familiar during his years at Harvard. All of these are thinkers for whom morality is a matter of reason alone. As for reciprocity, it is quite clearly a rational principle, not a feeling of any kind. For Kant, reciprocity was of the essence of any morality of rational creatures. Mr. Obama would certainly agree, although his stress lies on full and equal citizens. Consider also in this connection Mr. Obama's invocation of our aversion to self-diminution as the ultimate support of our practice of empathy. As you'll recall, he mentions this twice, first in recounting his own adolescent moral awakening, and then in his prescription of empathy to all. This reflects the quasi-Kantian centrality of dignity to his understanding. If we are scrupulous in taking account of the viewpoints of others, that's because self-respect is the anchor of our own. I would think less of myself if I did not make every effort to empathize with you, that is, to think of you as my equal. This Kantian notion of morality as the true expression of human dignity further underscores the intellectualism of Mr. Obama's conception. Again, not a spontaneous gush of feeling for the other, but a strong sense of self and of the behavior worthy of a human self informs what he means by empathy. Now, since I've mentioned Kant, this is perhaps a good place to defend empathy against the criticism that, with its emphasis on donning the perspectives of others, it encourages moral relativism. Nothing could be further from Mr. Obama's intention. If anything, he understands empathy as an alternative to and check upon any impulse toward relativism. If you steep yourself in particular partial perspectives, it's to fuel your ascent toward an ever more general one, as your own perspective expands by absorbing these. You've seen the world from all sides now. That's the song of empathy. This may be a quixotic vision, but it's not a relativistic one. For those of you who study 18th century thought, it recalls the impartial spectator of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. Interestingly enough, on the eve of the 2008 election, the two candidates were asked by a New York Times journalist to mention the books that had been most important in their lives. And very strikingly, Mr. Obama mentioned Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments as one of the books that had been most important in his life. The next section of my talk is entitled Textbook Empathy. Now, Mr. Obama's rhetoric of empathy has much to be said for it. Above all, it expresses a serious concern for citizenship and civic virtue. In this, it represents real progress over and a powerful antidote to the rhetoric of mere compassion. But is his notion of empathy coherent? Here it might be useful to compare it with that prevailing among psychologists and social scientists. Now, after canvassing a number of definitions and essential agreement among themselves, I've decided to adopt that of Wikipedia, which, while otherwise unremarkable, includes a caution overlooked by Mr. Obama. The Wikipedist in his wisdom writes as follows: empathy is the capability to share and understand another's emotions and feelings. It is often characterized as the ability to put oneself into another's shoes. Empathy does not necessarily imply compassion, sympathy, or empathic concern, because this capacity can be present in a context of cruel behavior as well as compassionate. End of definition. Now, the first sentence of this paragraph states the element common to all standard definitions of empathy, the capability to share and understand another's emotions and feelings. The second restates it colloquially. The third states the caution I mentioned. While empathy is the capacity of entering into the feelings of others, it implies no consequent sympathy with them, let alone an impulse to assist them. Having entered empathetically into someone's world, we may well reject him as unworthy of assistance. You can't grasp what it means to be a Nazi without an exercise of empathy. This in no way implies that Nazis deserve our sympathy. From this, it follows that, as the Wikipedist suggests, empathy is even compatible with an intention to harm. We might reasonably wish harm to the Nazi. Even beyond this, however, far beyond it, is the man who delights in torture for its own sake. He too displays a heightened empathy. No one is more keenly aware than he is of just how much torture hurts. In popular speech, then, empathy often denotes a sentiment akin to compassion or sympathy. Mr. Obama, as we've seen, presents it as a principle. As defined precisely or scientifically, however, it's neither of these, but merely a capacity. So what Mr. Obama proposes as empathy is different not only from the popular view, but from the scientific one. His notion, while presupposing our capacity to enter into the feelings of others, develops this in a particular direction, a possible but by no means necessary direction. There's a second difficulty with Mr. Obama's understanding. This is his further assumption that empathy not only entails a desire to help, but implies certain policies of helping. In presenting himself as the empathy candidate, Mr. Obama implied that his were the empathy policies. In fact, however, as empathy is one thing and the desire to help another, the question of the policies most likely to help is yet a third. No empathy with the poor, however deep, will even begin to resolve the question of whether the most effective responses to their plight are those promoted by Mr. Obama. On this question, reasonable and equally empathetic people will differ. What distinguishes the convinced free market economist from Mr. Obama is not less empathy toward the poor or even less sympathy for them. It's disagreement about how the economy works, how wealth and opportunity are created, how people at the bottom can be helped to rise. Neither empathy nor sympathy as such would affect the tilt in American politics intended by Mr. Obama, only his policies would. Was the Mr. Obama of the audacity of hope aware of these confusions? Perhaps not. In the warm afterglow of his adolescent moral awakening, he might have come to exaggerate how far empathy can carry us. So too might he have concluded that to enter fully into the perspective of the poor was ipso facto to grasp the need for an expanded public sector in order to effectively address their problems. Then again, perhaps he was aware of these difficulties. Shrewd politician that he was, he must have recognized the advantages of ascribing his social program entirely to empathy. Empathy president, that had a ring to it. Empathy plus sympathy plus a debatable set of macroeconomic and social welfare policy assumptions president, that didn't have such a ring to it. Few things exert so powerful a charm as a squaring of the moral circle. In combining an air of impartiality with an endorsement of liberal partisanship, Mr. Obama's empathy was bound to resonate with Democrats. Still, since previous squarings of the circle, moral or otherwise, have somehow always failed, we're entitled to a certain skepticism concerning this one. On the ground, whether in the corridors of power or the murky channels of media spin, it's been partisan business as usual. Mr. Obama probably hoped to attract some Republican support for his ambitious plans, including health insurance reform, but if so, he's been disappointed. The last thing they've been willing to do is to concede him partisan advantage by conceding that he practices nonpartisanship, or by practicing any of their own. Then there are the hortatory emails that I receive almost daily from the Democratic National Committee, many of which arrive under the name of Mr. Obama himself. These have not urged me to try to put myself in the shoes of Republicans to see the president's programs as they do. They haven't even sought to remind me that those Americans who disagree with him do so patriotically and in good faith. Now, you might say that it's unreasonable, even in a sense unfair, to hold Obama the president to the lofty standards announced by Obama the candidate, and even less fair to hold his hirelings at the Democratic National Committee to them. That's a point well taken, but it's actually irrelevant to the one I'm making. My claim isn't that Mr. Obama and his followers are to be blamed for having abandoned empathy for partisanship. It's that despite his best intentions, empathy as he sketches it is actually more likely to fan the flames of partisanship than to quench them. Begin with the inevitable link between empathy and self-righteousness. Self-righteousness both inevitably attends partisanship and inevitably aggravates it. Empathy, if it's to restrain the one, would have to temper the other. Mr. Obama's version of empathy, however, seems less likely to moderate partisan self-righteousness than to encourage it. Recall that he presents his partisan agenda, the tilting of American society toward the interest of the struggling, as itself the demand of empathy. The empathy that Mr. Obama has urged on Democrats thus appears ambiguous and contradictory. On the one hand, it is empathy with Republicans, which as such is to mitigate partisanship toward them. On the other, it is empathy toward the downtrodden, which is to goad good Democrats ever onward. The audacity of hope promotes both these versions of empathy, and Mr. Obama has obviously set himself the task of exemplifying them. In theory, there's no necessary conflict between the two. In practice, it may prove a different story. For one thing, any such politics of empathy tends to stigmatize all who disagree with it as unempathetic, than which there is nothing worse to be. Political partisanship being what it is, this outcome is almost inevitable. Consider leading Democratic Party intellectual George Lakoff, who, writing at the outset of the Obama era, simply equated, quote, progressive, unquote, political notions with empathy. He thus consigned dissenters with those notions to the outer darkness. Clearly, this version of empathy would provide little help in mitigating partisanship. Just as clearly, many Democrats subscribe to it and are encouraged to do so by all that incitement from the DNC. To which we must add that even the other aspect of Mr. Obama's empathy is practiced not toward the struggling but toward one's political opponents, may make its own paradoxical contribution toward harshness toward those opponents. It follows from Mr. Obama's vision that having soared empathetically above partisan divides, you can return to the fray with a clear conscience, perhaps we might even say with a vengeance. You've stood in your opponent's shoes and done your level best to comprehend his profoundly misguided worldview. No one can reasonably demand more of you than that. So it's back to partisan business as usual, buoyed by an added sense of righteousness for having made such a commendable effort. And it might be added toward adversaries who have shown so little sign of reciprocating it. Nothing so inflames partisanship as the illusion of having transcended it. So we couldn't necessarily look to Obamaites, even the most honorable and best intentioned, to treat their adversaries with more consideration than their predecessors had. If then you were a Democrat with healthy partisan instincts, blue in tooth and claw, you could delight in Mr. Obama's empathy. If you were a Republican, not so much. So where does Mr. Obama go from here, and to what extent can empathy serve as his guide? As we've seen, he views it as implying a certain vision of American society, one of mutual help and mutual civic recognition. This is potentially a radical vision, but also one in which the poor are to be called upon to rise above mere clientism. It should never be forgotten that Mr. Obama spent 20 years drinking at the font of the Reverend Jeremiah Wright and his gospel of black self-help. On the whole, this interpretation of empathy would support a drift toward bigger government, but only on the presumption that this would eventually lessen the reliance of the poor on the state. Liberals may find this combination enchanting, while conservatives will reject it as contradictory, doubting that any expansion of government programs can serve to emancipate the poor from dependence on government programs. For now, circumstance has denied Mr. Obama smooth sailing toward the actualization of his vision, although it's not unreasonable to regard his health care reform as the intended entering wedge in this direction. Given the current ascendancy of the Republicans in Congress, any further progress is bound to be fraught with compromise and a disappointment to his core supporters. Consider how adversely they reacted to his deal with the Republicans to prolong the Bush tax cuts in return for the further extension of unemployment benefits. Yet this situation offers him the perfect opportunity for stressing that emanation of his vision of sympathy that is parallel or even identical with civility. And the evidence suggests that this is music to the ears of most Americans. Consider in this connection the great success of his speech at Tucson last month following the shooting there. Public response to the speech was, according to one poll, 78% positive, and must have been partly, even largely, responsible for the simultaneous spike in his overall job performance ratings. Whatever others may make of him, Mr. Obama continues to see himself as a statesman standing above party and partisanship, one who, unlike his opponents, is actuated by a lofty civic vision. This vision, anchored in empathy and its consort civility, was very much on display in Tucson. There he rose above tacky surroundings to deliver perhaps the best speech of his career. True, it did not promote any item of his legislative agenda, but perhaps Mr. Obama is at his best promoting no item of his legislative agenda. The event, quote, Tucson and America thriving together, unquote, was quite as inane as its title. Amateurishness brushed shoulders with banality, boosterism, and political correctness. Actually, one learned from this event, which anybody like me who teaches at a large university knew already: you should never trust a large university to plan any major event. This criticism, however, does not apply to small liberal arts colleges like Hiram or planners like Professor Kortansky. Amateurishness brushed shoulders with banality, boosterism, and political correctness. By the time Mr. Obama's turn came, there was no occasion to rise to, only a mishmash in need of redemption. And Mr. Obama redeemed it. He did a star turn as the president of all the people. He sensibly refrained from editorializing about the shooting. How much was there to say about the act of the luckless madman whose grinning, suffering face, 22 years old going on 50, was now known to viewers around the world? Equally wise was the decision to postpone discussion of any policy changes that the incident might suggest. This wasn't the time or the place to weigh in on guns or mental health care or the supposed but wholly undemonstrated role of inflammatory rhetoric in inflaming the gunman. Mr. Obama acknowledged that such a national discussion had begun, but rather than join in it, which would inevitably have proved controversial and therefore divisive, he enjoined civility in its conduct. Indeed, he presented just this civility as the appropriate legacy of the shooting, the proper lesson to be drawn from it. Not, he noted carefully, because incivility had caused the shooting, but because civility would do justice to the memory of the victims. And to his plea for civility, he added one for empathy, while demonstrating his own empathetic capacity by his moving eulogy of the victims. Mr. Obama makes no secret of deriving his inspiration from Lincoln. Without this touch of megalomania, he would not be such a compelling figure. In fact, his theme at Tucson that evening was the greatest of Lincoln's themes, that of civic rededication. As Lincoln invoked those fallen at Gettysburg as models for the required reconsecration of Americans to their nation's principles, so Mr. Obama offered the victims of Tucson. A few dead rather than many have this advantage for the eulogist. You can commemorate each of them by name. Mr. Obama did so with telling and moving details. At the same time, he cast them as exemplifying the best in ordinary Americans like them: parents, grandparents, spouses, veterans, public servants, finally children. Fine people all, but no finer than we can all be, was Mr. Obama's suggestion. Especially touching was his portrayal of the youngest victim, the 9-year-old girl born on 9/11. Nothing is harder than to memorialize a child without bathos, but Mr. Obama mostly avoided bathos. Yet much as Mr. Obama aspires to be Lincoln, Tucson was not Gettysburg. The one was a great battle, the turning point in a war deciding the fate of a nation. The other was a deplorable but minor event and a senseless rather than a significant one. Mr. Obama had to make a lot from a little. His soaring rhetoric craves a great cause, but that cause continues to elude him. Empathy defines a vision, even as he sees it a direction or a drift, but these two fall well short of a cause. Can Mr. Obama have expected a partisan payoff from so studiedly nonpartisan a speech? Yes, if, as he seems to think, his lofty vision of civility and empathy will necessarily garner support for him, given Republican opponents who are either Sarah Palin or an anonymous pack of naysayers. Mrs. Palin will always be Mrs. Palin. As for those other Republicans, with their accession to control of the Congress, the ball is in their court. Okay, thank you.